Bonjour à toutes et à tous, c'est Pascal de Neutrality
Hello everyone, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm once again joined by Jean-Daniel Ruch, former Swiss ambassador to Serbia, Israel and Turkey. Ambassador Ruch is also the founder of the Geneva Center for Neutrality, and he is one of the main supporters of the Neutrality Initiative, a popular referendum that we will probably vote on in 2026 in Switzerland. That's what we want to talk about today. Jean-Daniel, welcome.
Bienvenue.
Hello, Pascal. Very happy to be here again.
Merci beaucoup pour ton temps et puis j'aimerais bien te demander.
Thank you very much for your time. I'd really like to ask you how you see our initiative on neutrality. And I say our, not because I'm personally involved in the initiative itself, but because I also think it's an important initiative and something we should win. How do you see the initiative itself?
Comment est-ce que tu vois l'initiative elle-même?
D'abord, ce que je vois, c'est surtout la neutralité.
First of all, what I see is mainly neutrality. I think this concept of neutrality is really important in today's world. It's not just about Switzerland, but about the world. At one point, we believed that the world could be governed by international law, and that there would be rules applied to almost everything, whether in trade or, of course, in conflict resolution. And now we see, as we have for several years actually, that this isn't a system that will dominate the world in the years or generations to come, that we are operating within power dynamics. And when we talk about a power struggle, we're talking about major powers dividing zones of influence among themselves. And I believe that for the future of humanity, given the challenges we face, whether it's climate change, the issues raised by new technologies, including artificial intelligence, or a new arms race with the emergence of extremely destabilizing weapons systems, also because they're driven by artificial intelligence. In short, to face all these challenges, we can't rely on the great powers, which are inevitably in opposition, in contradiction with overlapping interests, and whose relationships are inevitably marked by mistrust. So, I think it's essential for the world of tomorrow, but also for the survival of humanity, to have a critical mass of independent countries that don't align themselves with any bloc, and that can think and act independently, concerned not with particular interests, but with the common good of the planet and of humanity. So for me, it's within this framework that the debate on neutrality in Switzerland takes place. Because Switzerland is fortunate, it has the privilege of still benefiting from significant soft power in the world today, which is tied to its neutrality. If you show the Swiss flag in Botswana, Colombia, or Korea, people will say, "Ah, Switzerland, neutrality."
Les gens vont dire, "Ah, la Suisse, la neutralité." Une association immédiate, émotionnelle presque.
There is an immediate, emotional, almost spontaneous or subliminal association between the Swiss flag, which everyone recognizes, and the concept of neutrality. So I think that if it wished to, if its authorities wished to, Switzerland could play a catalytic role in bringing together a coalition of states that would not align with either bloc. The concept of being neutral or non-aligned is somewhat outdated. However, I believe that the concept of active neutrality is becoming important again in the world, relevant, and Switzerland could take a leading role if it chose to. And that's precisely the value of this initiative, to restore credibility to neutrality, but also to restore credibility, a role, and a perspective to Switzerland's international action.
Oui, et tu le dis, alors si notre...
Yes, you said it. So, if our government wanted to, in fact, that's what we saw in Switzerland. The Federal Council's approach, in my view, was no longer a proper understanding of neutrality, but rather partiality, taking one side in the global conflict we're seeing now. How do you think the Neutrality Initiative could help address the problems we're currently facing with our government's interpretation of neutrality?
Du côté de notre gouvernement.
Je pense que notre gouvernement a adopté une attitude purement
I think our government adopted a purely defensive attitude, especially starting in February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, which under international law, to me is an act of aggression. Switzerland was immediately put under pressure and decided to adopt the sanctions. I don't know, there was a somewhat strange episode when on a Thursday, they announced that they wouldn't adopt the sanctions, that we would do what we had always done. Well, what we had been doing since 2014. That is, we would take measures to prevent sanctions from being circumvented through Switzerland. And then, on Tuesday, they completely reversed their position and announced that they were adopting the sanctions.
Ils ont annoncé qu'ils reprenaient les sanctions. Qu'est-ce qui s'est passé entre ce jeudi et ce mardi?
What happened this Thursday and Tuesday? We were never really told the truth. We heard in the hallways that there had been pressure, but we don't know exactly from whom, nor the nature of that pressure. What's certain is that there was fear in Bern, within the Federal Council, which led to this stance. But it was defensive. It was to avoid criticism, to avoid perhaps pressure, maybe even sanctions. I think that as a Swiss citizen, especially in a country that practices direct democracy, we've seen that the Swiss people can be very mature in their decisions, even when it comes to raising taxes or reducing vacation time.
Même quand il s'agit d'augmenter les impôts ou de diminuer les vacances. Donc, je pense qu'on aurait le droit d'être traités comme des
So I think we should have the right to be treated like adults and to have the truth explained to us. But that, so far, no one has done. So this defensive attitude continues to prevail in Switzerland. We've claimed that we remain neutral because, strictly speaking, if we look at the law of neutrality, we're not providing a military advantage to either Ukraine or Russia. So the conditions of neutrality are more or less being met. But on another front, another conflict, the Israeli conflict, not only with the Palestinians, but also with Iran, Qatar, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and even Tunisia is being attacked by Israel.
Même la Tunisie est attaquée par Israël. Là, le problème se pose différemment, semble-t-il, puisqu'on continue.
Here the problem seems to be different, since dual-use goods are still being sold and investments in the Israeli military industry are still being authorized. So, to me, it feels like we're violating the very principle of neutrality. In short, what we're seeing in Bern is a lack of consistency, a lack of clarity, and above all, a lack of independence in how the situation and policy are being analyzed. And I think this debate on neutrality should help our leaders gain more confidence, feel stronger, and truly develop a policy that is neutral, but above all, independent from all the pressures and influences that reach Bern.
The opponents of the initiative say that we shouldn't create definitions of neutrality that are too strict. The Federal Council must be able to interpret neutrality according to the needs of the moment. And then, the initiative actually aims to create a framework within which the Federal Council and our departments can act. What's your interpretation? Why is it important to write a definition into our Constitution? Why do we need a definition in the Constitution?
Pourquoi est-ce qu'il faut une définition dans la Constitution?
Je crois que la raison.
I believe the reason for this debate is that because of the policy pursued by the Federal Council, especially since 2022, the credibility of Swiss neutrality has been seriously damaged in the Russian sphere, but also in the Middle East. So in my view, the purpose of this definition is to strengthen the Federal Council's position and to limit its room for maneuver. It is, in fact, the result of a Federal Council that has made decisions based precisely on defensiveness and weakness. If the Federal Council had resisted these pressures, if it had been consistent in implementing its foreign policy, including toward Israel, I think the issue would not have arisen.
Je pense que la question se serait pas posée si on avait continué le système.
If we had continued the system aimed at preventing the circumvention of sanctions that we had put in place since 2014, but now, the Federal Council has appeared weak, as if betraying one of the fundamentals of national identity, which is neutrality. That's how many Swiss people saw it. And so that's the role of direct democracy and of citizens, to remind these authorities that the people are sovereign. The sovereign is the people. And when they make decisions that don't suit part of the population, well, their room for maneuver must be limited so that they stay within certain boundaries. I'd like to say something that seems particularly important to me. I know that one of the opponent's arguments is that we shouldn't restrict the Federal Council's freedom of action. My view is quite the opposite. By adding this new provision to the federal constitution, which sets limits on what the Federal Council can do and on the political decisions it can make in certain circumstances, we actually strengthen it. We strengthen its backbone.
On renforce sa colonne vertébrale. Si vous avez dans la Constitution fédérale demain matin,
if, in the federal constitution, tomorrow morning, there's an article that says, Switzerland only adopts sanctions decided by the United Nations Security Council, and the day after tomorrow, the European Union comes and says, you're part of the democracies like us, you must show solidarity with the democracies, so adopt sanctions. The Federal Council will be able to say, listen, in the name of democracy, you can't force us to violate our constitution. And besides, as we've seen, sanctions are useless. It's not sanctions that will make Russia change its policy toward Ukraine. On the contrary, maybe sanctions even hurt those who impose them, that is the European Union, more than those who are targeted by them, meaning the Russians. So we would have a very strong argument to resist pressure from our friends.
Yes, so in that sense, the initiative also aims to give the Federal Council and the administration additional arguments to actually pursue a genuinely neutral policy. It's not just about changing their course, but also about strengthening the credibility of that path for the future.
Yes. And then I think it would be a weapon, a kind of armor almost, that the Federal Council could have to withstand this external pressure.
Yes, but the problem is mainly that there are people who don't want to resist, but who would like to follow the ideal of the European Union. And then, one thing I'd like to know your opinion is that the opponents, also on the left, and I'm a member of the Socialist Party, I pay my dues every year. Well, it pains me that there are people in the SP who call the initiative pro-Putin, with the idea that it could support the Russians if we don't impose sanctions on the wrongdoers. What can you say about that?
I think there was a wave of emotion in Switzerland, quite a natural one, when the Russians invaded Ukraine. And then, based on those emotions, of course, a kind of quick, emotional analysis of the situation developed, with good guys and bad guys. There are the good Ukrainians, the poor victims, and then the bad Russians, the aggressors. That's obviously a very limited view of the situation, because if we want to understand what happened in Ukraine, we don't necessarily need to go back to the 17th century. We could talk about the Holodomor, that sort of Ukrainian genocide committed by Stalin. But above all, we need to go back to the end of the Soviet Union, to the tensions that have emerged in Ukraine since 1991, between, let's say, a rather pro-Russian leaning, a rather pro-Western leaning, and historical resurgences. In short, it's an extremely complex system, in which we then saw a struggle for influence between the two great powers, the United States and Russia, play out in this poor country, which ultimately became the playground where Russian and American interests clashed. The Europeans were, of course, allied with the Americans. It's a proxy conflict between great powers. It's not the small fighting the large. It's a proxy conflict between great powers. And the very essence of our neutrality, since roughly the time of Nicholas of Fleury, but certainly since the 19th century, was to say that we do not want to get involved in great power conflicts. And we managed to do so successfully during the First World War, and again during the Second World War, at the cost of some not very glorious compromises, it must be admitted. But we managed. Why shouldn't we be able to do it any more today? Do we really want to take sides with a camp that isn't necessarily any more right than the other? That doesn't mean we shouldn't fight for respect for international law. It doesn't mean we shouldn't condemn war crimes. Of course not. We must support the work of the International Criminal Court, which has indicted Putin just as it has indicted Netanyahu. That obviously we must do. But we need the clarity to base our policy on a sound analysis. And a sound analysis isn't about saying there are good guys and bad guys. It's about recognizing that this is a conflict between great powers. Our interest, and Europe's as well, is for countries like ours to manage to stay above the fray.
You put it very well, actually. I think we absolutely need to base our analysis on what's happening among the major powers. On the other hand, there are people who say this initiative will put us at odds with the European Union, and that now, Switzerland, already having issues with its bilateral relations with the EU, shouldn't create even more friction. How do you see that?
Well, I think that's still an argument driven by fear, a defensive argument. I believe that to build a solid argument, a sound policy, instead of focusing on our weaknesses, we should look at our strengths. And in our relationship with the European Union, we have an extraordinary strength. First, as an employer, Swiss companies employ Europeans in Europe. Then as an employer of Europeans, French, Italian, German, who cross the border every day. And finally, as an economy that's fully integrated into the European economy, with interdependent relationships as well. I live in a region here, the Jura, where one of the main activities is subcontracting for the German automobile industry.
C'est de travailler comme sous-traitant pour l'industrie automobile allemande. Alors évidemment, on intéresse que l'industrie automobile allemande ou française.
So obviously it's in our interest for the German or French automotive industry to keep advancing, but dependence goes both ways. So to think that if the initiative passes, the European Union will what? Impose sanctions on us? No. The key to our relationship with the European Union lies in the bilateral agreements, in the new package of accords. And for me, that's a separate debate. It's not the same discussion. We're talking about Switzerland's role in the world, not just in Europe, but globally. Indeed, we're facing two options. We can align ourselves with Ms. von der Leyen, the Germans, and the French, which we've always refused to do. But we could suddenly decide to accept that.
On peut tout d'un coup accepter ça, c'est peut-être quelque part, c'est peut-être plus facile. Il y a moins besoin de réfléchir.
In a way, it might be easier. There's less need to think. But obviously, that would mean giving up a role in the world. Switzerland has had a reputation, a soft power, an influence far beyond its size, which it enjoyed during the post-Cold War periods. Of course, if the Swiss people want that, if we want to become a kind of Luxembourg of the Alps, why not? We wouldn't live much worse. But it would mark the end of the special and useful role that Switzerland has been able to play in the world through its tradition of neutrality, its humanitarian tradition, a center for multilateralism in Geneva, which wouldn't exist without neutrality. So it's an important choice, an identity choice for Switzerland, indeed, and for its place in the world.
To come back once again to our Federal Council, it now seems to me that we have a problem. The Council can basically go in whatever direction it wants. We learned 2 years ago that the Federal Council had spoken with Austria and Germany about the Sky Shield, and we know that a memorandum of understanding, was signed, according to which Switzerland and Austria will take part in the Sky Shield. But up to now, I've never seen that memorandum, and we don't know what's written in it. The Federal Council tells us that it included reservations related to our neutrality, but we don't know what those details are. And then, isn't it also true that we're in a situation where our administration is taking very, very great liberties with the future, including when it comes to Switzerland's security?
Ah, mais ça, on le voit dans différents domaines, mais toujours lié à la
But we see this in various areas, always related to security. Of course, you mentioned one example, but let's talk about all the military cooperation that exists with NATO. I'm not sure the Swiss people have an overall view of all the military partnerships that exist with NATO. And what's certain is that these military cooperations haven't been approved, neither by a popular vote, nor probably even by a parliamentary vote. So, there's really a democratic deficit in the way our security policies are built and implemented. It's the same thing with Israel.
C'est la même chose avec Israël. Il y a un organe de presse.
There's a media outlet, a German-speaking online magazine called Republic, that published an article last week titled, "Is there really no military cooperation between Switzerland and Israel?" They did remarkable research, because no one had ever told us that. The government doesn't provide information on the matter. It makes decisions without consulting the public, or more often, without even consulting Parliament. And the result is that there is extremely close military cooperation. And then there are all kinds of examples, but just one figure, one.
Et puis, mais juste un chiffre, un. Ils ont obtenu du département de la
They obtained from the Department of Defense information on the number of official Swiss visits. So, Swiss military personnel and employees of the Swiss military department to Israel over the past 12 years. More than 1,200 official trips. That's an average of 100 trips per year, or about 2 official trips per week. If that's not intense military cooperation, I don't know what is. And then, of course, there are plenty of other examples, including in arms purchases and all that. So yes, we have this lack of information, which in my opinion is a democratic deficit. There are actually F-16s flying over my house right now. I don't know if you can hear them all the way to Tokyo.
We can't hear anything. But anyway, when we talk about security policy, there are F-16s. That's one of the problems, isn't it? Now, when we think, during our administration we can see it in the Ministry of Defense, cooperation is only considered within the framework of NATO and the European Union. Cooperation is no longer thought of, no longer imagined elsewhere, also with other powers. So in my view, it's a big problem that Swiss security is conceptualized only with partners on one side.
Alors, c'était des F-18, j'ai dit F-16.
So, they were F-18s. I said F-16s. Obviously F-18s, we've lost count of them. I don't think we're going to develop military cooperation with Russia. Besides, that would be a violation of neutrality. How do we violate our neutrality with Israel? What I think would be in our interest is to try to maintain our own capabilities, at least in certain areas, so industrial capabilities in the military field. And for that, it's essential to work with the European Union, especially the European Union. But not in the sense of buying products from the European Union, but rather of having industrial cooperation with the European Union, just as we have cooperation in the pharmaceutical field, in machinery, and in all sectors. It's a form of cooperation that, given the technological challenges, seems essential to me, and I don't believe it goes against neutrality. That said, when diversification is possible, it should be pursued. And I'd like to give an example. There was, I believe in early November, a large British delegation led by the Prime Minister that went to Turkey to sign a major military cooperation agreement between the United Kingdom and Turkey. Turkey is an emerging country that invests heavily in the defense industry, particularly in drones. At the beginning of the war in Ukraine, they were selling drones to Ukraine while also mediating with Russia, by the way. Why couldn't Switzerland, which is obsessed with the technological capabilities of Israel or the United States, develop defense cooperation with emerging countries? Here I mentioned Turkey, but I imagine South Korea could also have things to offer us, among others. But indeed, trying to diversify, trying to broaden our scope, would also allow us to have wider horizons and to develop other types of influence and cooperation with those countries that are also investing a lot of money in innovation.
Qui investissent beaucoup d'argent dans l'innovation aussi.
Oui, c'est un très bon point. Et puis finalement, pour toi
Yes,
comme
that's a very good point.
diplomate,
And then finally,
est-ce que tu
for you
penses
as a
que
diplomat,
cette initiative
do you think
pourrait
this
aussi
initiative could also strengthen Swiss diplomacy?
Donc,
So not just foreign policy, but also what you ambassadors do outside of Switzerland.
c'est ce que vous, les ambassadeurs, faites en ailleurs de la Suisse.
Bon, je crois qu'il y a aussi une disposition
I believe there's also a provision in the initiative, and especially in the counterproposal. Personally, I think we should vote yes on 2A, by the way. The counterproposal calls for expanding Switzerland's mediation activities. Yes, that's it.
Voilà. À mon avis,
In my opinion. And then the counterproposal. It's not even certain yet that it will be on the ballot in the end, because the National Council hasn't finished the debate yet, right?
Avec le débat, n'est-ce pas?
alors j'espère qu'il y aura le contre-projet personnellement, parce que je trouve le
So I hope there will be the counterproposal personally, because I think the counterproposal is better than nothing.
Alors, d'abord, pour ce qui est
Now I
de
will
la
vote. I
diplomatie,
propose to vote yes to
évidemment,
both.
si la neutralité
So first, regarding the role of Swiss diplomacy. Obviously, if neutrality receives strong popular support, leading to a new constitutional provision, it will clearly strengthen our image and our role in the world. Because I think the kind of neutrality most Swiss people want is not passive neutrality, but active neutrality.
une neutralité passive, mais c'est une neutralité active. C'est une neutralité qui essaye de contribuer à
It's a form of neutrality that aims to contribute to resolving conflicts and major global issues. So, obviously. And then, if the counterproposal passes, or even the initiative, the Federal Council will still have to draw the necessary conclusions in terms of resources. Because if, for many years now, we've been overtaken in the field of mediation by Norway, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, and others, it's also because we're not investing enough money. I believe the budget for activities promoting peace, democracy, and mediation, what is it? Around 80 million per year, maybe even a little less.
peut-être même un petit peu moins, c'est de loin pas assez, et c'est de loin inférieur à ce que d'autres.
It's far from enough, and it's far below what other countries spend. So we haven't managed, or perhaps haven't wanted, to create a real strike force when it comes to mediation. Now, of course, when you compare military budgets with peace promotion budgets, it's ridiculous. With the cost of the F-35s, the 30 billion given to the army, and then here we end up giving very little money for those kinds of activities. So I hope that if the counterproposal, assuming it makes it onto the ballot, or the initiative passes, it will also lead to a massive increase in investments in Swiss peace promotion activities.
Dans les activités suisses de promotion de la paix.
Oui, tout à fait. Il faut investir dans la paix.
Yes, absolutely. We need to invest in peace. We need to invest in neutrality. Jean-Daniel Ruch, for people who want to find you, where can they go to read what you write and see the work you're doing at the center?
Les travaux que vous faites dans le centre.
Alors d'abord, on a un website, hein, on a un site internet.
So first, we have a website. You just have to type GCN, Geneva Center for Neutrality, and then you'll get to the center, genevaneutrality.ch, I believe.
GenevaNeutrality.ch, je crois.
Je vais mettre le lien
I'll put the link in the description.
Mets le lien. À part ça, moi,
Please
toutes les
post the
semaines
link.
sur des sujets
Other than that,
politiques
I write every
internationaux,
week
j'essaie
about
de
international
refléter
politics, where I try to reflect my view of what's happening in Sudan, the Middle East, and Ukraine. This week, it was about the G20 and about Trump, who isn't going to the G20. Last week, it was about Sudan. The week before, it was about what's happening in the Caribbean, with Venezuela, Colombia, and the U.S. military deployment in that region. So I think that if we want to develop a vision, to try to develop a vision of the world's geopolitics that isn't partisan, people can read my articles, which come out every Thursday in Weltwoch. I'm not sure the socialist audience will like that, and in the Quotidien Jurassien in French.
et dans le quotidien jurassien en français.
La Belle Vosges
La Belle Vosges still publishes opinions from across the spectrum, from the left as well as the right.
de la gauche, de la droite, c'est encore un des...
For me, these aren't opinion pieces. They're really papers where I try to analyze a topic that seems important to me from a geopolitical perspective in the context of today's world history.
Histoire du monde actuel.
Et j'ai toujours aimé des
I've always loved interpretations and analyses. So everyone, go find Jean-Daniel Ruch in Weltwoch, then at the Geneva Center for Neutrality, and in the Quotidien Jurassien. Everyone, Jean-Daniel Ruch, thank you for your time today.
Jean-Daniel Ruch, merci pour ton temps aujourd'hui.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Pascal.